we've now covered all the really basic stuff around Elixir so far. Like, so how do I generate a project? How do I run some code? Blah, blah, blah. You know, lists, strings, whatever, that boring stuff. That's the type of stuff that I would expect you to be able to go out to any existing resource, any document, and kind of figure out, you know, hey, how do I write a string in Elixir? So in this section, we're going to start doing a big transition, and I want to focus a lot more about the design patterns of Elixir. Okay, so we're going to not write a lot of code in this section. We're going to focus a lot more on how do we write code in Elixir? What type of approach do we want to take here? So let's get started with it. It's going to be kind of a long section, so buckle in. We created a method in the last section called createDeck. And I want you to take special notice of the fact that right now we're just returning an array of strings, right? We've got an array of what we're calling cards, more or less, you know, an actual playing card. And we're doing that as opposed to, say, maybe assigning an instance variable to something like, you know, this.myDeck. And so this is what I'm about to write on the screen is not valid Elixir code at all, so don't do it. You'll notice that we didn't do something like this.myDeck, right? And that's something we might do if we were working with Ruby or Java or even JavaScript. We might take this type of approach right here. But you'll notice that we did not do anything like that. We specifically returned a value from this method right here. So this is actually something that's extremely important when it comes to object-oriented versus functional programming. So let's expand on this topic big time. This is going to be the first of many, many discussions about the differences between functional and object-oriented programming. Out of everything that we're going to learn in this course, making a clear distinction in your head between object-oriented and functional programming is the most important thing that I want you to learn. Okay? So even if you're not like strictly familiar with object-oriented programming, you know, if you didn't go through college classes or any type of academic instruction on object-oriented programming or anything like that, I still encourage you to stick through this. It's absolutely valuable and you will gain a lot from it. Okay, so I'm going to pull up a diagram and we're going to kind of walk through an object-oriented approach right now. And so I know that this diagram looks a little bit crazy, just bear with me for 1 second. I want you to assume for a second that we're developers, you know, you and I are developers, and we're writing some very traditional object-oriented code in like Java, Ruby, whatever it is, and we want to put together this app that we're working on, like, you know, something to deal cards, shuffle them, and somehow just like manipulate playing cards. So how might we approach that? How might we approach that with kind of an object-oriented approach? Well, I'm going to suggest maybe we would make like 2 classes, right? Like a deck class and a card class. So the card class might have 2 properties. Maybe it'll have something like this.suit to be something like, you know, diamonds, clubs, whatever. And it might also have a value that would record something like ace, 2, 3, 4. And then when we put these 2 properties together, we would end up with something like king of hearts, 2 of diamonds, ace of spades, whatever it might be. And then our deck class might create like an array of these cards, right? We might have like this.cards, and it's an array of card objects. Then our deck class might also have instance methods like, you know, shuffle, save, load, all that kind of good stuff. So here's the important part here. Here's like the really important thing that I'm trying to point out. Each of these methods right here, like shuffle, save, and load, would work on its local instance variable of like this.cards, that like array of card objects, okay? That last part is very key. In an object-oriented approach, we could probably like definitely a valid way of approaching this problem or this application. In an object-oriented approach, we could have an instance of a class with some methods like shuffle, save, and load that operate on its own local instance variable, you know, something like this.cards. Okay, so in practice, if we were going to write this out, and I know this is kind of ugly here, but just bear with me, we might have some amount of code that looks like this. This is kind of like pseudocode on the left-hand side, and then kind of like the return values on the right-hand side. Okay, so we're kind of pretending this is code that I would write out here. Given a like deck class, I might do something like make a new deck. So like new deck, and that makes an instance of the deck right here. So basically I got like this deck thing, right? And it represents, it has its own set of cards. I can shuffle them, whatever it might be. And so if I reference like deck.cards, I get back the array of cards. If I say deck.shuffle, it shuffles the cards. And if I do deck.deal, it'll return like my deck or like a new deck with just one card, right? The whole point here, like the entire point of all this, is that I have this deck class and it has its own local collection of cards. Whenever I call a method on the class, it operates on that local collection. Okay, that's like the whole big point. That's like what I'm trying to get at here with an object-oriented approach. So let's pivot now, and we're going to talk about how we would approach this exact same application with a functional programming approach. And so this is like not even necessarily Elixir right now. This is like how I might approach this with functional programming. And so I know this is another kind of crazy diagram here, but let's walk through it. This is a diagram of how we might approach this app with Elixir or, again, any functional programming language. In the middle here, we have our cards module. Our cards module. In this approach, we have no concept of a class or an instance of a class. So a module is a standalone object, and it has absolutely no idea what an instance variable is. So there's no such thing as like this.cards. There's no such thing as like this.deck or anything like that. Okay, that's not a thing, not a concept at all. Cards.module is its own just kind of standalone thing sitting there in memory. You can't create copies of it, you can't instantiate it, nothing like that. Modules in Elixir are collections of methods and absolutely nothing more. So we have no instance variables whatsoever. That means that whenever we want to create a deck or like, a collection of cards, we can call create deck, and instead of setting that deck to like, this.mydeck or something like that, it's going to instead return our array or like list of strings, where each string in there represents a single card. Similarly, whenever I want to shuffle a deck, whenever I want to shuffle like a list of cards, I will pass in an array of strings, or like my array of cards right here, and it will return back to me a new shuffled list of cards. So again, let me be clear for like the millionth time, in Elixir, there's absolutely no concept of instance variables. All of the data that we work with inside of our application are going to be data structures made out of primitive variables like strings and numbers and stuff like that, that represent the absolute like bare essence of the data that we're working with. Whenever we want to take some action on a piece of data, we're going to take that data, we're going to pass it into a method, the method is going to process it, and then it's going to spit out some result back to us. And so the same exact thing happens down here with save. So when I pass in my like list of cards, it goes into save. There's no instance variables, nothing like that in there. It just returns back a string that is a reference to the the string that is the path to the saved file. Similarly, whenever I want to load a deck of cards, I'll pass in a string that is the path to the saved file, and I'll get back like the return value is my array of cards. When I load a deck of cards, nothing like gets set to an instance variable or anything like that. So you might be thinking, all right, seems simpler enough, but why bother? What's the difference here? Fantastic question. So that is the question that we are going to be answering throughout this entire course. Elixir has a few features that make writing apps with this approach just a total breeze. And as we learn more about Elixir, I think that this approach is really going to become very natural to you. So this type of approach of saying, I don't have an instance of a class, I just have some primitive data sitting around, like a list of strings. I pass it into a method, the method does something to it, and then it spits some result back out to us. Okay, so that's my first kind of big spiel on object-oriented versus functional programming. Let's take this approach right here, this kind of like idea of how we write code, and let's start applying it in the next section.